Dwight David Eisenhower was born on the 14th of October, 1890, in Denison, Texas. He was the third of 7 sons born to David, Jacob Eisenhower, and Ida Elizabeth Stover, a couple of mixed German, English, and Swiss ancestry. In 1892, the family moved to Abilene, a small town in Kansas where Dwight spent most of his childhood. Life in the Eisenhower household was modest and strongly shaped by religious faith. His parents emphasized discipline, thrift, and honesty, values that became deeply rooted in Eisenhower from an early age. As a boy, Dwight was bright, energetic, and endlessly curious. Yet he also had to work hard to help support the family. His father earned a modest wage at a creamery, and the children were expected to contribute. Dwight and his brothers planted vegetables, delivered newspapers, and took on odd jobs around town. Growing up without financial comfort taught him perseverance, responsibility, and independence. One childhood story that followed Eisenhower throughout his life took place when he was 10 years old. Upset because he wasn't allowed to go trick-or-treating with his older brother on Halloween, Dwight ran outside and punched a tree until his hands were injured. When his mother discovered what happened, she calmly tended to his wounds and reminded him that anger accomplishes nothing. She told him, "The person who can control himself is greater than the one who can conquer a city." That lesson stayed with Eisenhower forever, shaping the calm temperament and emotional control that later defined his leadership style. During his teenage years, Eisenhower attended Abilene High School, graduating in 1909. History quickly became his favorite subject, especially stories of great military commanders. He devoured biographies of figures like Hannibal and George Washington, reading every book on warfare he could find. Classmates often remarked that Dwight's memory and knowledge of military history were so strong that he could easily have become a professor if he wished. But financial hardship limited his educational opportunities. After high school, Eisenhower set aside his own college ambitions so he could work and help support his family while giving his older brother a chance to continue his studies. For 2 years, Dwight labored on the night shift at the Bell Springs Creamery, saving money and strengthening his resolve. His sacrifice reflected a long-standing family tradition. When resources were scarce, the Eisenhower brothers took turns supporting one another's education. By 1911, encouraged by a close friend, Dwight Eisenhower decided to apply to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He had originally hoped to attend the Naval Academy at Annapolis, but he was already past the age limit. With the support of a Kansas senator who provided the required nomination, Eisenhower earned admission to one of the most prestigious military schools in the nation. When completing his enrollment paperwork, he made a small but meaningful change. He reversed his given names, becoming Dwight David Eisenhower instead of David Dwight Eisenhower, partly to avoid confusion with his father, who shared the same name. In June 1911, the young man from Kansas crossed through the gates of West Point, beginning a military journey that would span more than 40 years. At the academy, Eisenhower quickly adapted to the strict discipline of military life and blended into the routines of a cadet. He stood out in athletics, most notably as a talented football player for the academy team. A significant knee injury, however, ended his athletic career sooner than he had hoped. Although the setback disappointed him at the time, Eisenhower later reflected that the experience taught him humility, patience, and the importance of perseverance. Academically, Eisenhower performed respectably, neither at the very top nor the bottom of his class. He graduated in 1915, ranking 61st out of 164 cadets. Interestingly, his graduating class would later be nicknamed the class the stars fell on, because nearly 60 of its members eventually became generals. As for Eisenhower, the newly commissioned second lieutenant who left West Point that year would go on to rise far beyond the expectations of his classmates, and ultimately become one of the most celebrated military leaders in American history. After graduating from West Point, Second Lieutenant Dwight Eisenhower received his first assignment with an infantry unit at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. His early military career unfolded during a relatively calm period until World War I erupted in Europe in 1914 and gradually drew the United States toward involvement. Although America did not officially enter the war until 1917, Eisenhower was eager to serve overseas. Like many ambitious young officers, he hoped for a chance to test himself in combat. But circumstances took a different turn. Throughout the entire conflict, Eisenhower was never deployed to Europe. Instead, the Army recognized his talent for training and organization, assigning him to instruct new recruits and to help build a newly formed tank unit within the United States. He served at several posts, including Fort Leavenworth in Kansas and later Camp Colt in Pennsylvania, where he commanded the Army's primary tank training center. Even without setting foot on the front lines, Eisenhower played a vital role in preparing thousands of soldiers for service abroad. These years, spent shaping curricula, managing logistics, and leading large groups of trainees, strengthened his skills as a planner and leader, offsetting the disappointment of not being sent into battle. His performance earned him rapid advancement, and by the end of the war, he held the temporary rank of lieutenant colonel at just 28 years old. He also received the Distinguished Service Medal for his contributions as a trainer. Though he often expressed regret about missing the experience of serving overseas, Eisenhower later acknowledged that avoiding the intense trauma of trench warfare allowed him to maintain a clearer perspective when leading troops during the next global conflict. When the war ended in 1918, the U.S. Army began a massive reduction in force. Many wartime officers were required to leave service or return to lower ranks. Eisenhower was no exception. From his temporary rank of lieutenant colonel, he reverted to the permanent rank of captain after the war, though he was promoted to major a few months later. This was a challenging period for him. Eisenhower watched close colleagues depart the Army in search of stability in civilian life, and he himself faced a slowdown in career progression. He completed routine assignments at Camp Meade in Maryland and devoted his free time to self-study, immersing himself in military theory, tactics, and especially armored warfare, a subject he had grown passionate about since his time at Camp Colt. Eisenhower frequently exchanged ideas with fellow officers who shared his interest in tank warfare, including Captain George S. Patton, an energetic and forward-thinking armor specialist. Both believed strongly in the future of mechanized forces, but at the time, many senior leaders resisted these new ideas, insisting that tanks remain strictly subordinate to infantry. Eisenhower was even reprimanded for pushing his concepts too far. These professional frustrations coincided with profound personal hardship. In 1921, Eisenhower and his wife, Mamie, experienced the devastating loss of their first son, who passed away due to a severe illness. The early 1920s thus became a period of immense pressure, professionally and emotionally. Yet Eisenhower did not give up. Instead, he continued building his expertise, refining his ideas, and quietly preparing for the moment when opportunity would finally appear. The persistence he showed during these difficult years would become one of the defining strengths of his future leadership. A turning point in Eisenhower's career came in 1922, when he was assigned as an aide to General Fox Connor. Connor was widely respected, a thoughtful, highly educated officer who at the time commanded U.S. forces in the Panama Canal Zone. Under Connor's mentorship, Eisenhower absorbed a wealth of knowledge about military art, organizational leadership, and long-range strategy. Connor encouraged the young officer to study the great works of military history, from the campaigns of Napoleon to the theories of Karl von Clausewitz. Many evenings in Panama were spent with Eisenhower reading intensely and discussing with his commander the possibility of another global conflict. It was Connor who first warned him that Europe might face another major war in the near future, and advised him to prepare intellectually, strategically, and by seeking opportunities to work alongside the best minds in the Army. Through Connor's recommendation, Eisenhower was later selected to attend the prestigious Army Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth from 1925 to 1926. He graduated near the top of his class. Some accounts say first overall, solidifying his reputation as a highly promising officer. For the rest of his life, Eisenhower regarded Fox Connor as one of the greatest influences on his development as both a strategist and a leader. By the late 1920s, Eisenhower received another extraordinary opportunity, the chance to work closely with General Douglas MacArthur. In 1929, when MacArthur became the Army's Chief of Staff, Eisenhower was brought to Washington, D.C., to serve on the War Department staff. There, he authored a comprehensive mobilization plan for the Army in the event the nation entered a large-scale conflict. MacArthur was deeply impressed and soon selected Eisenhower to be his senior military aide. For the next 7 years, from 1929 to 1936, Eisenhower worked at MacArthur's side, gaining invaluable experience. He assisted in major Army initiatives, including oversight of the Veterans Encampment in 1932 during the Bonus March, and later accompanied MacArthur to the Philippines as part of a long-term effort to help develop that nation's defense forces. These years, though challenging, became another crucial chapter in shaping the Eisenhower who would one day lead Allied armies across Europe. In 1935, General Douglas MacArthur retired from the U.S. Army, but soon accepted an invitation from the Philippine government to help build its national defense forces. At the time, the Philippines was a self-governing commonwealth under U.S. sovereignty, preparing for full independence. Eisenhower and his family followed MacArthur to Manila, where he served as Chief of Staff for the American Military Advisory Mission. In Southeast Asia, far from everything familiar, Eisenhower once again had to demonstrate his adaptability and leadership. He helped MacArthur design the organizational structure of the Philippine Army, oversaw training for local troops, and provided guidance on the island's long-term defense strategy. Working under MacArthur was not always easy. The general was known for his strong personality and firm opinions, which sometimes led to disagreements. One well-known story claims that, when their work in the Philippines ended in 1939, MacArthur remarked to Eisenhower, "You may hope I die young, so you can be famous. But don't worry, within 5 years, you'll be a general." Half joking or not, the prediction turned out to be remarkably accurate. In December 1939, just before the outbreak of World War II in the Pacific, Eisenhower left the Philippines and returned to the United States. By then, he had reached the rank of colonel and gained extensive strategic experience, ready for far greater responsibilities. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States initially stood neutral. But by late 1941, global events were evolving rapidly. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked the American base at Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into the war and expanding the conflict across multiple continents. At that moment, Dwight Eisenhower was serving on the War Department's General Staff in Washington, D.C., under Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. Eisenhower's skill in planning and organization quickly drew Marshall's attention. Only days after Pearl Harbor, Marshall assigned him the task of drafting the initial strategies for operations against both Japan and Nazi Germany. From late 1941 onward, Eisenhower's rise was rapid. Promoted to brigadier general, he soon took on a series of influential roles within the wartime command structure. By mid-1942, the Allied nations faced mounting pressure to open a new front to relieve the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. The chosen solution was to launch a major landing in North Africa, a move designed to strike at weaker Axis positions in the Mediterranean before attempting a full invasion of mainland Europe. Eisenhower was selected to command this multinational force and lead Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, then controlled by Vichy French authorities aligned with Germany. In November 1942, under Eisenhower's leadership, tens of thousands of American and British troops landed simultaneously along the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. It was Eisenhower's first major combat operation as a commander of a large international coalition. Although the Allies initially met resistance and U.S. forces suffered serious setbacks, particularly at the Kasserine Pass early in 1943, the North African campaign ultimately succeeded. By May 1943, German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered, and the entire region was secured by the Allies. This victory elevated Eisenhower's reputation as a capable battlefield leader. and demonstrated his exceptional ability to coordinate multinational armies and manage strong-willed commanders such as America's General George S. Patton and Britain's Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Following the victory in North Africa, Eisenhower continued to serve as the Allied commander for the next major operations in the Mediterranean. In July 1943, he directed the Allied landings on the island of Sicily, Operation Husky, which opened the path toward freeing Italy from fascist control. The campaign succeeded, leading to the collapse of the fascist government and the removal of Benito Mussolini from power. In September 1943, under Eisenhower's leadership, British and American forces advanced onto mainland Italy. Although the Italian government soon agreed to an armistice, German forces quickly moved in to occupy key positions and mounted strong resistance. The Italian campaign became a long and demanding struggle, with the Allies pushing forward gradually through well-defended lines, while simultaneously preparing for a much larger objective, a decisive assault on Nazi Germany's stronghold in Western Europe. By late 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a momentous decision. He appointed Dwight D. Eisenhower as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the leader responsible for planning and executing Operation Overlord, the Allied landing in Normandy, France. This mission was the most critical undertaking of the entire war, opening a second front in Europe and launching a direct strike into German-occupied territory. Eisenhower relocated to England in early 1944, assembling an international staff of military planners and coordinating closely with Allied leaders, including British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, and many others. His role required extraordinary diplomatic skill as he balanced differing national priorities while shaping a unified strategy. The decisive moment arrived in June 1944. The initial date for the landings was set for June 5, but severe weather over the English Channel forced Eisenhower to postpone the operation. After reviewing the latest forecasts and weighing the risks, he made the final call. In the early hours of the 6th of June 1944, Eisenhower gave the order to begin the operation with the simple, determined words, "Let's go." What followed was the largest seaborne invasion in history. Thousands of ships and aircraft, along with approximately 156,000 Allied troops, moved toward the shores of Normandy. This monumental undertaking, known to the world as D-Day, became the turning point that began the liberation of Western Europe. The Normandy campaign was intense and demanding, but it ultimately became one of the most decisive Allied victories of the entire war. Under Eisenhower's overall command, Allied forces broke through Germany's Atlantic Wall defenses along the French shoreline and established a critical foothold on the European continent. From the Normandy beachhead, the Allies advanced steadily, and by late August 1944, they liberated Paris, ending 4 years of German occupation. This sweeping success elevated Eisenhower's reputation to extraordinary heights. In December 1944, he was promoted to General of the Army, a 5-star rank granted to only a few U.S. officers in history. Yet the war in Europe was not finished. In December 1944, German forces launched a sudden counteroffensive in the Ardennes, a clash known as the Battle of the Bulge. Faced with this urgent situation, Eisenhower calmly reorganized Allied positions and placed his trust in commanders such as General George Patton to respond rapidly. After several weeks of intense winter combat, the Allies halted and pushed back Germany's final major offensive in the West. By early 1945, under Eisenhower's coordination, British and American armies crossed the Rhine River and advanced into Germany from the west, while Soviet forces moved toward Berlin from the east. Recognizing that German resistance was collapsing, Eisenhower focused on securing remaining strategic objectives rather than engaging in a race with the Soviets for the German capital. In early May 1945, Nazi Germany fell completely. On May 7, German representatives signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. The following day, May 8, became known worldwide as Victory in Europe Day, marking the formal end of the war in Europe. By this moment, Dwight D. Eisenhower had become one of the most admired figures of his time, celebrated across the free world for his steady leadership and his role in guiding the Allied forces to victory. After the war, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an important question. What should come next for a man whose military achievements had already shaped world history? He returned to the United States in June 1945, greeted by enthusiastic crowds and widespread media attention. A few months later, in November 1945, President Harry S. Truman appointed him Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the highest position within the Army's leadership. In this new role, Eisenhower confronted challenges very different from those he faced during wartime. He now had to help transition the military to a peacetime footing, manage major reductions in defense spending, and oversee the demobilization of millions of service members returning to civilian life. At the same time, the nation was shifting its economic priorities from wartime production to domestic recovery. Eisenhower played a key role in debates that eventually led to the National Security Act of 1947, which created a unified Department of Defense, established the U.S. Air Force as a separate service, and formed agencies such as the CIA. During these years, global tensions also began to rise. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated rapidly, marking the early stages of the Cold War. Eisenhower clearly recognized the growing threat posed by Soviet influence in Europe and strongly supported the Marshall Plan as a way to help rebuild the continent's economies and reduce the appeal of communist expansion. In 1948, Eisenhower made a surprising career shift. He temporarily stepped away from military service to become president of Columbia University in New York City. Many were astonished by the move, as transitioning from the armed forces to academia was an unusual step. Eisenhower viewed the role as a much-needed pause after years of wartime pressure and an opportunity to contribute to the education of younger generations. During his tenure at Columbia, Eisenhower tried to apply his disciplined leadership style to a large civilian institution. He later admitted that running a university presented challenges very different from those of the military. Still, his time there was far from separate from public affairs. Eisenhower used these years to write his memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948. The book gave a vivid account of his experiences during World War II and quickly became a bestseller, reinforcing his image as the victorious Allied commander. By the late 1940s, Eisenhower was increasingly viewed as a national figure whose influence extended well beyond the military. Many Americans began encouraging him to enter politics, believing he could guide the country through the complex years of the early Cold War. In 1950, war broke out once again, this time on the Korean Peninsula, raising global concern about the expanding influence of communism. With unmatched military credibility and international respect, Eisenhower was the natural choice for a new and urgent responsibility. President Truman, along with America's European allies, selected him to lead the newly created North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In December 1950, Eisenhower returned to active military service, stepping away from his position at Columbia University to become the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He relocated to Paris, where he established NATO's headquarters and began organizing a unified defense force for Western Europe. For the first time, nations across the Atlantic cooperated to form a coordinated, peacetime military alliance. Drawing on his wartime experience, Eisenhower worked to strengthen trust among former wartime partners and even former adversaries like Germany and Italy, under the common goal of protecting Europe from potential Soviet aggression. Yet, just as Eisenhower reached the peak of his international military career, political events at home began to pull him back to the United States. By 1952, the American presidential election unfolded in a climate of uncertainty. The Democratic Party had held the presidency for 20 consecutive years, and the Korean conflict showed no clear resolution under President Truman. Many Americans were ready for change and hoped for a leader who could restore stability and confidence. Dwight D. Eisenhower, widely admired as the victorious commander of World War II and known for his integrity and patriotism, quickly emerged as a compelling candidate. Though he had never publicly aligned himself with any political party, he ultimately chose to run for president as a Republican. His campaign gained momentum as he defeated Senator Robert A. Taft, an influential figure with more isolationist views, to secure the party's nomination. Eisenhower promised to confront what he saw as the three pressing concerns of the time: communism, Korea, and corruption. His slogan, "I like Ike," swept across the nation, symbolizing the warm public affection he inspired. In the November 1952 general election, Eisenhower won a decisive victory over Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, becoming the 34th President of the United States. In January 1953, at the age of 62, Dwight D. Eisenhower took the oath of office, beginning a new chapter in his life, not as a military commander, but as the elected leader of the nation he had long served. Taking office at the height of Cold War tensions, President Eisenhower quickly demonstrated a leadership style that was firm yet cautious. His first priority was to fulfill his campaign promise, ending the conflict in Korea. Even before his inauguration, Eisenhower traveled to Korea in December 1952 to assess the situation firsthand. After returning to Washington, he signaled that the United States was prepared to take stronger measures, up to and including enhanced strategic capabilities, if the opposing side refused to negotiate. This pressure, combined with the exhaustion of all parties after 3 years of fighting, helped pave the way for an armistice. In July 1953, the agreement was signed, bringing an end to active combat. While the Korean peninsula remained divided, the cessation of hostilities saved countless lives and allowed the administration to redirect national focus toward other pressing issues. Domestically, Eisenhower described his philosophy as modern republicanism, financially conservative but socially balanced. Rather than dismantling the New Deal programs established by Franklin Roosevelt, he preserved most of them and even strengthened key components like Social Security. His administration emphasized balanced budgets whenever possible, efficient federal operations, and investment in transformative long-term projects. One of these projects became a defining achievement of his presidency: the Interstate Highway System. In 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, launching the nationwide construction of an interconnected network of high-speed roads. Inspired partly by his own difficult cross-country military convoy experience in 1919, and partly by observing the strategic value of Germany's Autobahn system, Eisenhower believed America needed a modern highway network for both national defense and economic growth. The result was one of the largest infrastructure endeavors in U.S. history, an enduring legacy that reshaped American transportation and commerce. Meanwhile, Eisenhower's popularity remained exceptionally strong. In the 1956 election, he won a second term with ease, once again defeating Adlai Stevenson by a wide margin. With the confidence of the voters behind him, Eisenhower entered his second term, spanning 1957 to 1961, determined to continue advancing the goals he had set for the nation. At the same time, major domestic changes, especially the growing civil rights movement led by African Americans, began to challenge Eisenhower's leadership. Raised in the more moderate environment of Kansas, Eisenhower was not a supporter of racial discrimination, yet he was also not a bold social reformer. He believed strongly in gradual progress and in upholding the rule of law. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring segregated public schools unconstitutional and calling for an end to the separate but equal doctrine. Although Eisenhower did not publicly celebrate the decision, he made it clear that the federal government would respect and enforce the court's ruling when several southern states hesitated to implement it. A defining test came in 1,957 inches, Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor refused to allow a group of black students to enter the previously all-white Central High School, despite a federal court order. As tensions escalated, President Eisenhower made a decisive choice. He deployed paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to ensure the students' safe entry and to uphold federal law. It was the first time since the Civil War that a U.S. president sent federal troops to enforce civil rights protections, a turning point In the movement, although Eisenhower personally spoke little about civil rights, his willingness to act demonstrated his commitment to defending the Constitution and the legal rights of American citizens above regional political pressure. That same year, Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction era. The act established the Civil Rights Commission to investigate barriers to voting. In 1960, he signed a second civil rights bill aimed at strengthening protections for voters. While these measures were limited compared to what civil rights leaders demanded, they laid essential legal groundwork for the sweeping reforms that would follow in the 1960s. On the global stage, the Eisenhower administration focused on containing the spread of communism, but approached this mission with caution, aiming to avoid drawing the United States into direct, prolonged wars. During the Cold War, Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, developed a strategy known as large-scale strategic deterrence. The idea was to rely heavily on America's advanced atomic capabilities as a way to discourage potential adversaries such as the Soviet Union and China from initiating conflict, while reducing the financial burden of maintaining a massive standing army. Eisenhower believed that a strong strategic arsenal would deter aggression, allowing the nation to avoid costly conventional buildups. The approach did help limit military spending, but it also accelerated a high-stakes technological and weapons competition between the superpowers. In addition, the Eisenhower administration supported the creation of global security alliances designed to counter Soviet influence. These included the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, and the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, forming a series of regional partnerships that aligned U.S. interests with those of key allies across Asia and the Middle East. At the same time, Eisenhower did not shy away from using covert intelligence methods when he believed U.S. national security or geopolitical balance was at risk. During his presidency, the CIA played a role in political operations abroad, including actions that contributed to the removal of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. These operations remain controversial today, but they reflected the hardline strategic mindset that defined much of Cold War policy in that era. Throughout his two presidential terms, Eisenhower faced a series of complex international crises that tested both his judgment and his strategic philosophy. One of the most significant occurred in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, when Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Egypt to regain control of the Suez Canal after its nationalization. Eisenhower took a surprising stance. He strongly opposed the action. He worried that a unilateral intervention would push Arab nations closer to the Soviet Union and undermine the moral standing of the Western powers. Through firm diplomatic and economic pressure, the United States persuaded Britain and France to withdraw. The episode signaled the declining global influence of old colonial powers and highlighted the emergence of the United States as the leading Western voice in international affairs. In the aftermath, Eisenhower introduced the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957, pledging American economic and security assistance to Middle Eastern nations seeking to resist communist expansion. A practical example came in 1958, when the United States deployed forces to Lebanon at the request of its president to help stabilize the country during a period of internal tension believed to be influenced by broader Cold War dynamics. That same year, another major crisis unfolded in Eastern Europe. In Hungary, a nationwide uprising sought to challenge the communist government in Budapest. Although Eisenhower sympathized with the Hungarian desire for greater freedom, he chose not to intervene militarily, understanding that Hungary lay within the Soviet sphere of influence and that direct U.S. involvement risked igniting a far larger global conflict. While the decision disappointed many Hungarians, analysts later viewed it as a measured choice that likely helped prevent a direct confrontation between the superpowers. Eisenhower also played a consequential role in the transition of power in Vietnam and Indochina after the French withdrew. In 1954, as French forces faced severe setbacks at Dien Bien Phu and prepared to accept the Geneva Agreements dividing Vietnam, Eisenhower considered possible American intervention. Ultimately, he decided against deploying U.S. forces, partly due to a lack of support from Congress and key allies, and partly out of concern that the United States might become entangled in a protracted colonial conflict. Although he chose not to send troops, Eisenhower swiftly moved to support the newly formed government of South Vietnam under Ngo Dinh Diem. The United States provided economic assistance, military advisors, and institutional guidance with the aim of establishing South Vietnam as a stronghold against communist influence in Southeast Asia, a strategy shaped by the domino theory, which held that if one nation fell under communist control, neighboring states might follow. These policies marked the beginning of America's deepening involvement in Vietnam, setting the stage for the complex decades that followed. In dealing with the major communist powers, President Eisenhower maintained a firm stance while still searching for opportunities to ease tensions. In 1953, the passing of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin briefly raised hopes that East-West relations might improve. Eisenhower responded with his Chance for Peace speech, urging both sides to redirect military spending toward global prosperity. However, the Soviet Union did not embrace his proposal. In 1955, Eisenhower attended the Geneva Summit with leaders from Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the first high-level East-West meeting since World War II. There, he introduced the Open Skies proposal, which called for mutual aerial transparency between the United States and the Soviet Union to reduce the risk of military miscalculation. The Soviets rejected the idea, but the meeting still helped reduce some of the mistrust that had accumulated through the early Cold War. A brief moment of optimism followed in 1959, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States at Eisenhower's invitation. The two sides planned another summit in Paris for 1960 to discuss arms control measures. But shortly before the conference, an international incident shattered the progress. A U.S. U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was brought down over Soviet territory, and its pilot, Gary Powers, was taken into custody. Initially, the U.S. government denied the mission's purpose. But when the Soviets revealed the pilot and the aircraft's equipment, Eisenhower acknowledged responsibility. Khrushchev withdrew from the summit, dealing a serious setback to Eisenhower's diplomatic efforts in the final year of his presidency. Even so, the 8 years of Eisenhower's administration, from 1953 to 1961, are often remembered as a period of relative stability and prosperity, especially compared with the turbulence that came before and after. Eisenhower guided the country through significant global challenges without allowing the United States to be drawn into a direct military confrontation with other major powers. At home, he preserved social order and emphasized calm, steady governance. He also established important precedents for modern presidential management, including a professionalized White House staff and a decision-making style that relied on careful consultation with advisors, even though the final choice always rested with him. After 2 terms, Eisenhower left the White House in January 1961, handing over the presidency to John F. Kennedy. He became the first president affected by the newly ratified 22nd Amendment, which limited presidents to 2 elected terms. At age 70, Eisenhower returned to private life but remained an influential elder statesman. He settled at his family farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a location rich with Civil War history, and coincidentally, the same region where he had once trained tank crews early in his military career. During retirement, Eisenhower wrote 2 presidential memoirs, Mandate for Change, 1963, and Waging Peace, 1965. He continued to offer informal advice to his successors. President Kennedy consulted him after the Bay of Pigs incident in 1961, and President Lyndon B. Johnson later sought his views on American strategy in Vietnam, even as Eisenhower's health was beginning to decline. In his final years, Dwight D. Eisenhower's health declined due to ongoing heart problems. Even during his presidency, he had faced serious medical challenges, including a major heart episode in 1955 and a mild stroke in 1957, but recovered each time and continued working. After retirement, he experienced several additional heart-related issues. By early 1969, his condition worsened significantly. Eisenhower passed away on the 28th of March, 1969, in Washington, D.C., at the age of 78. His funeral was held with full national honors and attended by leaders from across the United States and around the world. He was laid to rest at the place of meditation on the grounds of the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, where he rests beside his wife and their first son. The legacy Dwight D. Eisenhower left behind, both for America and for the world, is extraordinary. As a military leader, he played a central role in freeing Europe from the grip of fascism. His ability to unite the Allied coalition and plan complex operations helped turn the tide of World War II. His name is forever linked with the historic D-Day landings, an event often described as one of the defining turning points of the 20th century. As president, Eisenhower guided the United States through some of the Cold War's most challenging years while maintaining stability and growth at home. He strengthened America's long-term infrastructure and technological capacity through initiatives such as the Interstate Highway System, and by supporting the early years of the U.S. space program. NASA was founded in 1958 under his administration. These decisions helped anchor America's economic and scientific leadership for decades to come. Internationally, Eisenhower was a key architect of the post-World War II world order. The creation of NATO, the first peacetime collective defense alliance in Western history, reflected his belief in cooperation among like-minded nations to maintain security. NATO quickly became a cornerstone of European stability and remains vital even today. His doctrines and containment policies provided strategic direction for the United States throughout the Cold War. Eisenhower also understood not only the power of military strength, but its limitations. In his 1961 farewell address, he offered a lasting warning about the growing influence of what he called the military-industrial complex, the relationship between the armed forces and the defense industry. He cautioned future leaders to ensure that national priorities and democratic values were never overshadowed by this influence. Over time, this message has been widely regarded as one of the most insightful cautions ever spoken by an American president. Historians today often place Dwight D. Eisenhower among the most effective presidents in U.S. history. He is praised for balancing strength with restraint, combining strategic vision with careful administrative discipline. Public opinion surveys also show that many Americans continue to hold a deep affection for Ike, seeing him as a leader who was honest, straightforward, and guided by duty rather than ambition. He led the United States through complex, often turbulent, post-war years without allowing the nation to be drawn into catastrophic conflict, all while sustaining social and economic progress. His legacy survives in the highways that span the nation, in strategic policies still studied today, and in the institutions shaped by his leadership. More than that, Eisenhower's story from a small-town boy in Kansas to Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces and ultimately President of the United States stands as a powerful expression of the American dream. It reminds us of what can be achieved through determination, integrity, and a lifelong commitment to public service.